You've just watched Mrs. Rex's class and made a list of things that she did to avoid those management hotspots. So looking back at the list of hotspots you remembered from your own teaching, are there any of Mrs. Rex's strategies that you think might help? Pause and take just a moment to put a star by any of Mrs. Rex's solutions that you think might be helpful in your teaching. After you've done that, go ahead and restart the presentation. Two key concepts in planning for differentiation are creating respectful tasks and planning for flexible grouping. And it's in the grouping part that management issues often come up. So let's take some time and think about successful grouping. The key concept here is that groups should be flexible so that students are working in a variety of groups that you've planned for based on different elements of student learning, like their readiness, their interests, and their learning preferences. You want to be sure to include both homogeneous and heterogeneous groups so that kids have the opportunity to hear thinking that's both similar to and different from their own. Here's what flexible grouping is not. We don't want kids stuck in the same groups all the time with the stigmas that might be attached to those groups. No stagnant groups. It's important that groups be changing, be dynamic, because just like stagnant water, stagnant groups stink. So that's why we've got all these different configurations that we can think about when planning for small groups. When you mix it up based on readiness, interest, learning profile, sometimes homogeneous, sometimes heterogeneous, you've got many, many different options for grouping. When planning for grouping, we want to ensure that groups are productive, that they're flexible, and that they're working for each student. So here's a teacher checklist for group work. I'm going to have you pause the video in just a second and find 2 or 3 that you want to keep in mind, and then jot a note to remind yourself of which ones you really want to focus some attention on. Go ahead and pause now, read over this list, and jot down a couple of notes. Next, we're going to talk about ways of assigning groups. So letting kids know which group they're going to be in is an important management task. You don't want it to eat up lots of precious instructional time and turn into a big management disaster. There's a handout also on Blackboard with the following slides so that you can reference it later. One of the most common ways of assigning groups is just using clothespins that have the students' names on them and then clipping them onto a chart with the different stations or groups or activities that you want kids to do. Another way is to just use a copy of the class roster and change the font color so that kids' names are color-coded for the group that they'll be in. Then kids can quickly find their name and their color when you show the list. For example, if you project it on the smartboard, and then it's really easy for you to change the groups because you can easily change the font on the roster. Pocket charts like this one are a good way to designate groups. If you don't have a pocket chart, creating a display using laminated cardstock and Velcro works well too. For groups that are more static, that you're going to keep the same over a period of time, you can assign clock groups, and then kids know who their 11 o'clock group is, for example, and then they can meet with that mixed readiness group whenever you say go to your 11 o'clock group. And notice also that there's a variety in the number of students per group represented here. Pairs, triads, quads, so you can make, that's another way you can mix up the group, is by having different numbers in your groupings. Here are a few tips for giving directions for group work. pause the video and take a moment to read over the list and jot down a note to yourself about any of these that you want to remember. Include that in your notes. After you've done that, restart the presentation. In addition to my Ask 3 Before Me rule, let's think about some other ideas for how students can get help. Next, you're going to watch a short video about the 3 B's, blood, bones, and barf, that are the only causes for interrupting the teacher. You'll find the video link in our announcement. And then after watching the video, open part 3 of today's presentation.